This is the story of how one enslaved woman transformed a plantation house into a mausoleum, and why her methodical elimination of an entire bloodline would haunt Baton Rouge long after the last scream faded into Louisiana night. The Beaumont plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of Louisiana's most fertile soil, where the Mississippi River curved like a serpent through land that had made fortunes from sugarcane and human misery. The sound of cicadas rose and fell in waves through humid August air, while the scent of magnolia blossoms mixed with something less pleasant, the ever-present smell of the sugar mill that ground human lives into white gold. Spanish moss draped the ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, waiting for their purpose, and the brick pathways beneath felt worn smooth by generations of feet that had never chosen to walk them. Margaret had arrived at the Beaumont estate in 1853, purchased at a New Orleans auction for the considerable sum of $1,200. Master Edmund Beaumont had bid high because he needed someone reliable to care for his growing family. 3 sons under the age of 8, with his wife expecting their 4th child that winter. What Edmund hadn't known was that Margaret carried within her a grief so profound it had crystallized into something harder than diamond and infinitely more dangerous. Her own children, twin boys named Samuel and Isaiah, had been sold away from her previous plantation when they turned 7, the age when field hands became more profitable than the cost of feeding them. She'd watched from the kitchen window as they disappeared down a dirt road in a wagon filled with other stolen childhoods, their small hands pressed against the wooden slats as they called for their mama until distance swallowed their voices. That was 3 years ago. The memory had fermented in Margaret's heart like wine, left too long in darkness, growing stronger and more bitter with each passing season. The Beaumont house stood like a white monument to prosperity, built on suffering, its columns reaching toward heaven, while its foundations rested on the bones of those who'd never seen freedom. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across mahogany furniture polished by hands that would never own anything, while Persian rugs muffled the footsteps of children who'd inherited their privilege, along with their father's cruelty. Margaret's quarters occupied a small room behind the kitchen, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a wooden chest that held her few possessions. But her real domain was the nursery on the 2nd floor, where she spent 14 hours each day tending to the Beaumont children with a patience that masked calculations their parents would never have imagined. Beaumont Household Ledger, August 15, 1856. Margaret continues to exceed expectations in child management. The boys respond well to her firm but gentle guidance. A most satisfactory purchase. 8-year-old Thomas, the eldest, had inherited his father's casual cruelty and had begun ordering Margaret around with the same tone Edmund used when discussing livestock prices. 6-year-old James possessed a quieter malice, delighting in small acts of meanness that he thought went unnoticed. 4-year-old William still retained some childhood innocence, but Margaret had watched enough plantation children to know that innocence would curdle into entitlement soon enough. She dressed them each morning, fed them their meals, read them stories, and tucked them into beds that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. And every night, as she listened to their breathing settle into sleep, she thought about Samuel and Isaiah, wondering if they were warm, if they had enough to eat, if they remembered the lullabies she used to sing. The planning began in September, when Mrs. Beaumont announced she was expecting again. The prospect of another child to care for another heir to the fortune built on her people's backs crystallized Margaret's resolve into something that felt less like decision and more like destiny. She started by observing patterns. Which nights Edmund stayed late in his study with his whiskey, when the house slaves finished their evening duties and retired to their quarters. How long it took for the Beaumont children to fall into deep sleep after their bedtime stories. Margaret had learned patience during 27 years of enslavement, but patience had limits, and she'd finally reached hers. The first opportunity came on October 15, 1856, when Edmund traveled to New Orleans on business and Mrs. Beaumont visited her sister in Natchez. The house felt different, with the master and mistress gone quieter, like a held breath waiting to be released. Margaret performed her evening routine with meticulous care. She bathed the children, dressed them in their night clothes, and read them their requested stories. Thomas demanded tales of adventure and conquest. James preferred stories about clever boys who outwitted their enemies. William simply wanted to hear about rabbits and friendly forest creatures. She sang them the same lullaby she'd once sung to Samuel and Isaiah, her voice steady and sweet as honey poured over broken glass. Vengeance dressed as bedtime routine. As the grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway chimed 10 p.m., Margaret stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching three sleeping faces that would never see another. Story is keeping you on the edge of your seat. Hit that like button and subscribe, because the darkest tales are the ones that history tried to bury. Thomas was sleeping so peacefully, his small chest rising and falling with the rhythm of innocence about to be interrupted forever. Thomas Beaumont's eyes opened at exactly 10:37 p.m., confusion flickering across his face before terror took its place. The rope was already around his neck, and Margaret's grip was as steady as her resolve. When the powerful sleep secure in their beds, they forget that those who serve them possess both hands and reasons to use them, reasons that have been growing stronger with each passing day of unpaid labor and stolen humanity. The struggle lasted less than 2 minutes, though it felt like hours to Margaret as she held the thrashing child against her chest. Thomas clawed at the rope, his small fingers desperate for purchase against the hemp that tightened with each movement. His legs kicked weakly at the quilted bedspread, but 8 years of privilege hadn't prepared his soft body for the kind of fight that would determine whether he'd see his 9th birthday. Margaret whispered the same lullaby she'd sung to him countless times, her voice never wavering even as Thomas's movements grew weaker. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was sending him to sleep with the same gentle melody she'd used to comfort him during thunderstorms and nightmares. When his struggles finally ceased, Margaret held him for another full minute, feeling the weight of his small body grow heavier as life departed. She arranged him carefully in his bed, positioning his arms at his sides and smoothing his sandy hair across the pillow. To anyone discovering him in the morning, Thomas would appear to have died peacefully in his sleep. 6-year-old James occupied the bed nearest the window, where moonlight filtered through lace curtains to illuminate his face. He'd always been a light sleeper, more suspicious than his older brother, with eyes that seemed to catalog every slight and injustice for future reference. But tonight, exhausted from a day of riding lessons and French tutoring, he slept deeply enough that Margaret's approach went unnoticed. The second length of rope felt heavier in her hands, weighted with the knowledge of what she'd already accomplished and what remained to be done. James stirred as she leaned over him, his eyelids fluttering, but the noose was around his throat before consciousness could fully return. Plantation Medical Log, October 16th, 1856. Thomas Beaumont, age 8, found deceased in bed, no apparent cause. James Beaumont, age 6, similarly discovered. Dr. Rousseau summoned immediately. James fought harder than his brother, his survival instincts sharper despite his youth. He managed to get 2 fingers beneath the rope, buying himself precious seconds of air. But Margaret had anticipated resistance. She'd practiced the technique on feed sacks in the barn, perfecting the angle and pressure required to overcome struggling prey. His eyes met hers in the moonlight, wide with betrayal and confusion. This was the woman who'd bandaged his scraped knees, who'd snuck him extra cookies when his parents weren't watching, who'd listened patiently to his complaints about his tutors and playmates. Now, she was the last face he'd ever see, and understanding flickered across his features in the final moments before darkness claimed him. Margaret felt nothing, no satisfaction, no remorse, no relief. The deed was necessity, like butchering hogs or harvesting cane. Some tasks required completion, regardless of personal feelings, and justice demanded payment that couldn't be measured in currency. 4-year-old William presented the greatest challenge, not because he was stronger than his brothers, but because he reminded Margaret most painfully of her own lost sons. His dark curls and gap-toothed smile had occasionally softened her heart during their years together, moments when she'd forgotten that his freedom had been purchased with her bondage. But sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford tonight. William would grow into the same casual cruelty as his brothers, would inherit the same plantation built on stolen lives, would perpetuate the same system that had torn Samuel and Isaiah from her arms. Better to end the cycle now, while he still possessed some innocence, than to allow him to become another Edmund Beaumont. William woke fully as the rope tightened, his eyes flying open to meet Margaret's steady gaze. But instead of fighting, he whispered, "Mama Margaret, what's happening?" She'd been Mama Margaret to him since he'd learned to speak, the closest thing to a mother he'd known since his birth mother had died in childbirth. The trust in his voice nearly shattered her resolve, but Margaret forced herself to remember Samuel's tears as the wagon carried him away, Isaiah's small hand reaching for her through the wooden slats. "Hush now, baby," she murmured, her voice gentle, even as her hands remained firm. "Just go to sleep. Mama Margaret's here." 3 children, 3 futures ended. The house fell silent, except for the grandfather clock's steady ticking, marking time that no longer mattered for the Beaumont heirs. Margaret moved through the nursery with practiced efficiency, checking each small body to ensure her work was complete, arranging bedclothes to suggest peaceful natural death. She gathered the ropes and returned them to the laundry, where they'd hang innocently among the other household cordage. Tomorrow, other slaves would use them to hang Master Edmund's shirts and Mrs. Catherine's petticoats, never knowing they'd served a different purpose this night. Margaret returned to her quarters behind the kitchen, where she undressed carefully and folded her clothes into the wooden chest. Her hands showed no tremor, her breathing remained steady, and when she finally lay down on her narrow bed, sleep came easily for the first time in 3 years. Morning would bring screams, tears, and frantic summoning of doctors who'd find no explanation for the simultaneous deaths of 3 healthy children. But that was tomorrow's concern. Tonight belonged to Samuel and Isaiah, wherever they were, and to the mother who'd finally found a way to balance the scales that had been weighted against her people for so long. But Margaret's work wasn't finished. Mrs. Catherine carried another Beaumont heir, and Edmund would undoubtedly remarry if his wife died in childbirth. The plantation would continue operating, continue grinding human lives into profit, continue breeding new generations of masters and slaves. Unless someone stopped it permanently, what happens when grief transforms into methodology, and a broken heart learns to beat in rhythm with calculated revenge? Margaret was about to discover that some kinds of justice require more than a single night's work. The morning bells would ring soon, and with them would come the discovery that would change everything about how the Beaumont plantation viewed the woman they trusted with their most precious possessions. Dr. Rousseau's hands trembled as he closed William's lifeless eyes, his 3rd examination in an hour, yielding the same impossible conclusion. 3 healthy children didn't simply die in their sleep without cause. Yet that's exactly what appeared to have happened. When the natural order breaks down so completely that physicians can't explain what they're seeing, those responsible for maintaining that order discover that their expertise means nothing in the face of deliberate chaos. The screams began at 6:43 a.m. when Celeste, the upstairs maid, entered the nursery to wake the children for their morning lessons. Her shriek echoed through the plantation house like a banshee's wail, bringing house slaves running from every corner of the estate. They found her collapsed in the doorway, pointing at the 3 beds where the Beaumont heirs lay in perfect repose, their faces peaceful, but their bodies cold as marble. Margaret arrived with the others, her expression perfectly calibrated to suggest shock and grief without overdoing the performance. She pushed through the gathering crowd, her voice breaking as she called each child's name, shaking their shoulders with increasing desperation, as reality, or the appearance of reality, set in. Master Thomas, Master James, oh Lord, no. Master William, wake up, baby, wake up. Her collapse beside William's bed was genuine enough to convince even herself the weight of what she'd done hadn't fully registered during the night's methodical work. But seeing the children in daylight, surrounded by the chaos her actions had created, brought the enormity of her choices into sharp focus. The sound of hoofbeats on gravel announced Dr. Rousseau's arrival, summoned by a frantic house slave who'd ridden hard to Baton Rouge. The physician had delivered all 3 Beaumont boys, had treated their childhood illnesses, had watched them grow into the promise of their father's legacy. Finding them dead without explanation challenged everything he understood about medicine and mortality. Medical examination notes, Dr. Henri Rousseau, October 16th, 1856. No evidence of trauma, poison, or disease. Bodies show signs of peaceful expiration. Cause of death remains undetermined despite thorough investigation. Dr. Rousseau's examination took 3 hours, during which he turned the children's bodies with scientific precision, searching for marks, wounds, or signs of illness that might explain the catastrophe. He found nothing, no bruising around their necks, no discoloration of their lips or fingernails, no evidence of struggle or violence. Margaret had chosen her method well. Strangulation, when performed correctly, left minimal physical evidence, especially on small bodies examined hours after death. The rope had compressed their airways just long enough to stop breathing, then been removed before post-mortem changes could reveal its presence. The household dissolved into chaos as news spread throughout the plantation. Field hands gathered in worried clusters, whispering about curses and supernatural intervention. House slaves moved through their duties like sleepwalkers, jumping at every sound and crossing themselves when they thought no one was watching. Master Edmund received word while conducting business in New Orleans, the telegram reaching him at the St. Charles Hotel, where he'd been celebrating a profitable sugar contract. His collapse in the hotel lobby became local legend, a powerful man brought to his knees by words on paper that destroyed everything he'd worked to build. Mrs. Catherine's sister brought her the news during their afternoon visit in Natchez. The pregnant woman fainted immediately, her body rejecting information too horrible for her mind to process. When she regained consciousness, her first words were, "Margaret, where is Margaret? She'll know what to do." The irony would have been amusing if the stakes weren't so deadly serious. Margaret maintained her performance throughout the day, alternating between stunned silence and sudden bursts of weeping that convinced everyone of her genuine grief.